What we're sharing today is a list of grants that Amy has helped different organizations win in the past, totaling over 172 million. So one of your biggest ones was Hope 6, 5 grants for 92 million. That's a significant impact right there. What was Hope 6 and where is it today?
Hope 6 was started around 2000, and it was designed for distressed public housing authority properties. The focus was on redevelopment, redesign, reconstruction, development, depending on what the property needed, and then what they call Community Social Services, CSS, which was a grant to provide services to the public housing residents of that site. That program revitalized dozens and dozens of properties around the country. There were flaws, and one of those flaws was that a lot of these agencies did not have leverage dollars in the deal, so it would only be dependent on the grant amount and maybe some other sources, but not significant enough sources to necessarily see these things through. And as a result, here it is 24 years later, there's still some Hope 6 projects, as I understand it, that have not completed. And so that had to be resolved. That Hope 6 was sort of the parent of the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative program. And those two implementation and planning grants were the place-based signature program and the Obama administration in public housing and in assisted housing. So there are two different changes. There's more money is required on the table, more money in the deal, and then partners are required. So it's a much broader program, and then it's focused on the whole neighborhood, not just the site itself, because that was the other thing with Hope 6. You just focused on the site, but you didn't look at the broader neighborhood. And the idea was, well, maybe that'll be a catalyst for redeveloping the whole distressed neighborhood, but it really wasn't. And so in Choice Neighborhoods, that's one of the most important aspects.
So when you talked about Hope 6, and one of the flaws was they didn't have leverage dollars in those projects. What does that mean exactly?
So leverage dollars are basically other people's money. It means actual dollars that are on the table by funding organizations. For example, with tax credits, if you've got your tax credit reservation letter, then you know that will happen. If you have from your city CDBG dollars, the mayor has written a letter saying, we pledge X dollars of CDBG funds over the following 5 years or whatever, that's leverage. If a service provider comes and says, okay, we will provide job training and placement for 25 residents each year for 7 years, that's leverage. And the good thing of having that leverage is that HUD's more comfortable that that will go through and be completed because there's all these other agencies at the table and because there's real dollars at the table. Their money isn't the only money in the game. Everybody wants these grants. Everybody wants them because it's tons of money, 30 million, and sometimes leveraged resources would make that 60 million. A lot of other money will come to the table with this, but you really have to be clear that you are competitive. It's very, very expensive to put these large applications together. I've heard the figure 250,000 in some cases. It's a lot of work to put these things together. So you really want to be sure that what you're going to put together could result in something that's fundable.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, today I have my co-host, Sherri Sangsanuva. She's been on a podcast before covering about grants and how she got a $2.4 million grant. And it's one of the most impactful and powerful podcast episodes that we've had because a lot of people have a lot of questions about grants. Now, today, Sherri introduced me to one of her friends, Amy Kell. And I'm bringing Amy onto the podcast today because, man, she talk about impact. She's won over 172 million in grants for public housing and organizations of all shapes and sizes. She's going to come on today. She's going to talk to you about the process of these grants, how to actually win them, how to create winning narratives for your grants and to help your project stand apart. Talk about invaluable experience. Amy, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's so good to be able to do this. Work, and I'm so glad to contribute.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this podcast for weeks, Amy, since I first talked to you. And my heart is just so full today. I am just so grateful that I get to be introduced to folks like you who have made such a huge impact in affordable housing. I normally wait till the end to say this, Amy, but thank you so much for what you do. Without people like you, I would have never had the home I grew up in.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful for you, Amy. And I cannot wait for the audience to hear from you and your experience and just hear your story a little bit. So obviously I threw some big numbers out there and how much money you won in grants for affordable housing. But Amy, for those people that don't know you, who's Amy and how did you even get into this career in the first place?
So I started in 1976. I was an intern for a national association at the time in Washington, D.C., and they sent me over to Coopers and Lybrand's to read a bunch of applications that housing authorities sent into HUD to modernize and improve the management of their troubled housing projects. And I remember there were just stacks and stacks of them in this cube, and I would pull them off and read them. And one I pulled out was in New Orleans, and it was the Desire Street property, like streetcar named Desire. It was named after it was this particular development. And I was reading about the Desire property and about how underneath garbage had been collected and what a mess it was. And they were going to do all these things. And I love the Tennessee William play. And I was just riveted. And I thought, wow, I mean, this has just moved me to another place. If I could do this, that would be really worth my while. So I found my way through this national association. I became a program manager. And then over the next years, I was in different situations in the public housing field. So I worked for national local associations, I worked for public housing authorities, and I created my own business to work with housing authorities. So that was kind of the work. And then midway, I took a break and I went to the University of Chicago Booth School of Business to get my MBA. And I did that in the late 80s. So I was able to bring experience and then my technical knowledge from the training that I got at Chicago to bear in this population and this problem, which I think is one of the biggest problems that this country suffers from. And it's not a moneymaker, so tell everybody it comes from the heart and from being able to make a meaningful contribution to people's lives. And the way you described it, Kent, that's why I did it. And that's why other people do it. It's just that you can make a difference and really help others along. And that's the goal, in my view. So that's how I started. I retired from my own business, Kell Consulting LLC, in December of 2022. And then 2 years went by, and I thought, I don't want to just be sitting around journaling and reading. And I was writing a memoir, and I thought I'd rather be involved, particularly with the changes that have occurred in the country. So I decided that my goal is to increase the supply of affordable housing, but I don't want to write these grant applications myself anymore. I want to help others to do it. And so that's when I created Grant Writing Sherpa, which was just literally a few weeks ago. And it's now a registered business. And my goal is to teach others how I did it, not to write the applications, not to oversee them or manage it, but just give everybody all the skills and the techniques and the knowledge that I learned so they can do it themselves. And so I just think this large effect over the country by skilled people who can compete for the funding that will be available, that's where I want to be right now.
Yes, I'm so glad you teed it up for me so well, Amy, where you talked about the skills, the knowledge, and most importantly, the techniques, because I'm very confident that the people that listen to this podcast, they don't listen to it for the fluff, right? They don't want to come on and say, oh, Amy won $172 million grants. Great accomplishment, but what can I learn from Amy that can help me apply that to my projects, to my life, that I can continue Amy's legacy of creating more affordable housing, taking all the knowledge from her decades of experience. She came out of retirement to help you all today. Like, talk about a woman with a big heart. This is Amy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad you came on, Amy. And with grant writing, when I first heard about grants, I talk about being overwhelmed. I just thought, I don't even know where to start. So maybe let's go ahead. You sent me an email and you helped me highlight a bunch of different grants that are available out there, including ones that you have won. So what I'm going to do is, and for folks that are listening on to their phones or listening to the cars, make sure you go to youtube.com/@Kent_HE, and you will be able to see the document that we are going to be sharing. Now, what we're sharing today is a list of grants that Amy has helped different organizations win in the past, totaling over 172 million. Amy, I'm going to just go down this list. I'm going to ask some questions, but feel free to just point out to me what are some of the ones that are really relevant and still around nowadays, because I want the content to be not just based on your historical knowledge, but what's going to be applicable to people's projects today.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of your biggest ones that jumped out to me was Hope 6, right? The Hope 6 grants, because you 5 grants for 92 million. That's a significant impact right there. What was Hope 6 and where is it today now?
Yeah, Hope 6 was started around 2000, and it was designed for public housing authority properties, distressed public housing authority properties. And the focus was on redevelopment, redesign, reconstruction, development, depending on what this property needed. And then what they call community social services, CSS, which was a grant to provide services to the public housing residents of that site. And so that program revitalized dozens and dozens of properties around the country. There were flaws, and one of those flaws was that a lot of these agencies did not have leverage dollars in the deal. So it would only be dependent on the grant amount and maybe some other sources, but not significant enough sources to necessarily see these things through. And as a result, here it is 24 years later, there's still some Hope 6 projects, as I understand it, that have not completed. And
Wow.
so that had to be resolved. That Hope 6 was sort of the parent of the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative program. And those two implementation and planning grants were the place-based signature program in the Obama administration. And that's what's really happening right now in public housing and in assisted housing. So there are two different changes. There's the more money is required on the table, more money in the deal, and then partners are required. And so it's a much broader program, and then it's focused on the whole neighborhood, not just the site itself. Because that was the other thing with Hope 6. You just focused on the site, but you didn't look at the broader neighborhood. And the idea was, well, maybe that'll be a catalyst for redeveloping the whole distressed neighborhood, but it really wasn't. And so in Choice Neighborhoods, that's one of the most important aspects. Okay, we are going to redevelop this site, but we're also going to take a look at this whole neighborhood. How can we transform the whole thing? And so you can see the changes that were made over the past 24 years for these kinds of programs. And I still think that as a model, Choice Neighborhoods is really where the world is going in these kinds of things.
So when you talked about Hope 6, right? And one of the flaws was they didn't have leverage dollars in those projects. What does that mean exactly? I want the audience to understand that.
Right. So leverage dollars are basically other people's money. And so in Hope 6, there was other people's money and there were tax credits. There was other people's money, but it wasn't to the great extent. Like one of the ones that I did, for example, we were able to use as leverage houses, units that we were going to sell on the market. And so we were able to say, okay, we'll price these units at X dollars and we're going to do 20 of them. And so X times 20, that's a leveraged amount, even though that wasn't a committed resource. We were anticipating that we would do that, but it wasn't on the table. And so the leverage dollars means actual dollars that are on the table by a funding organization. So, for example, with tax credits, if you've got your tax credit reservation letter, then you know that will happen. If you have from your city CDBG dollars, the mayor has written a letter saying, we pledge X dollars of CDBG funds over the following 5 years or whatever, that's leverage. If a service provider comes and says, okay, we will provide job training and placement for 25 residents each year for 7 years, that's leverage. And so that's what's required in Choice Neighborhoods. It was less so in Hope 6. And the good thing of having that leverage is that HUD's more comfortable that will go through and be completed because there's all these other agencies at the table and because there's real dollars at the table. Their money isn't the only money in the game. And so that's what leverage means.
Ooh, so if I could say that back to you, Amy. So it sounds like in Hope 6, one, most projects were just dependent on the grant money to make the project successful.
Mm-hmm.
When you went to the Choice Neighborhoods, because you had different agencies and parties and cities and municipalities that were contributing capital either from their allocation of funds or from a CDBG grant, now they're vested in the success of the project.
Exactly.
Did I get that right? Did I miss anything
That's
there?
exactly right. They're invested. They're truly committed. And that's what HUD wants to see. It makes sense because when you look back and you think, well, this Hope 6 thing that was awarded in 2005 never came to fruition. And so they're looking at money that was lost, time that was lost. And then, of course, they get beat up by Congress and so forth because they have people they have to respond to too. So that's the reason for it. And it makes infinite sense.
Got it. All right. So now that we've graduated from the Hope 6 to Choice Neighborhoods, I see that up here we have Choice Neighborhoods Implementation Grant and Choice Neighborhoods Planning Grant. For people that are listening right now, whether they're a city or a housing authority, what part of these grants apply to them? How should they think about it? Do they think about like, hey, I have this area in the city that I want to revitalize, and maybe this is how I should look at this grant and whether or not this grant is even applicable to my project? How should people understand whether or not this applies to them for the
Yeah,
choice
and that's
neighborhoods?
that's a really good point. Well, in terms of choice neighborhoods, it's specific. So HUD has a body of knowledge that they've gleaned through these various programs over the years. And so they have in mind a certain kind of property out there. And that property is a public housing property or assisted housing. It's distressed. It might be vacant. It may be in a neighborhood where there's significant crime and so forth. They have this model, choice neighborhoods, that they believe can be effective in addressing those particular properties. So if you have one of those properties, that's what you should take a look at it. And they make it easy. So there are variables, what gets scored, and one of those things, elements rather, is need. And so they have a certain way of looking at need. You map out the property, and then they have plugged into it US Census data and other data so you can figure out what the poverty rate is and the incidence of abandoned housing. And you go to your police department and you get police statistics. So you build your case there. And if you have what they want, then yeah, it's worth exploring. If you don't, it's probably not worth exploring. And so that's just it. Everybody wants these grants. Everybody wants them because it's tons of money, 30 million, and sometimes leveraged resources would make that 60 million. I mean, a lot of other money will come to the table with this, but you really have to be clear that you are competitive. It's very, very expensive to put these large applications together. I've heard the figure 250,000 in some cases because they're architectural drawings and engineering drawings, resident surveys, and so forth, evaluation schemes. It's a lot of work to put these things together. So you really want to be sure that what you're going to put together could result in something that's fundable.
Okay, that's extremely helpful. I mean, we eventually kind of went into the process a little bit there, Amy, where you talked about one, look at the criteria because, in your words, HUD probably has in mind what sort of projects they want to apply these grants towards.
Exactly.
And once you understand what the criteria is, look in that neighborhood. You use example of going to your police department and getting some stats on crime, etc. What other inputs can people get? So I heard about looking at HUD, looking at police crime data, looking at the census data. Is there any other inputs that you think you want to call out for the audience to make sure they're looking at when they're evaluating
Yeah.
their eligibility for choice neighborhoods?
Right. So HUD really wants to know what residents think. And that's another thing. A lot of housing authorities, we're all required to do surveys of residents when you put these things together. But in a really large site, like if you got a property with 600 units, that is going to require a really serious kind of study of resident views on a variety of subjects. And the last one that I worked on for a planning grant and an implementation grant plan, we had pages and pages and pages of data that we wanted to collect on each resident. And in Choice Neighborhoods implementation, you're required to follow each resident, provide them with case management services, and follow them through for the 7 years. And so it's a huge, humongous investment of time and effort. But the reason is HUD wants to make sure that residents aren't harmed through a gentrification process, for example. They want to make sure that those residents that have been sitting in this distressed public housing property or assisted housing property for decades in some cases won't be harmed, that their lives will be improved by this kind of funding. So that's one example.
Wow. So when you talked about getting data on all these residents, right? What does getting data mean? Does that mean you are doing surveys with the residents? Does that mean you're hiring a third party to understand and survey the residents on your behalf? What does that study really mean?
Right. So a lot of it's dependent on the size of the property. So if you're going to renovate or you revitalize a property of 200 units, and only 100 families are living there, well, that might be something that a staff could do. That's a small number. But if you have, like I say, a sizable property, 600 units, and it's full, you're talking about bringing in a third party, I think, to do something like that. Or if you are working with the city and the city has a large research department within it and is facile at doing these kinds of studies and analyzing the data and so forth, that's a way to do it. But it's a big investment. It has to be done properly, and it does involve different things. So it involves a one-on-one survey. It could also include focus groups. It could include outside community providers giving their opinions about what's needed in the community and so forth. So it's holistic.
Wow. I'm trying to think from the perspective, like, let's say you're working with a housing authority or a city, right? Obviously, you're shepherding the entire process of the grant writing. How much expectations do you have to set up front where you have to say, hey, you have to dedicate these resources to me to help do these studies, et cetera? Because it seems like, one, it's a long road ahead, but you also need everyone's time and energy to support the
Right,
grant writing process.
right, exactly
Tell us a
right.
little bit about that process. Like how do you set those expectations with the housing authorities and what demands do you make of them like to make the grant successful versus trying
Right.
to say, hey, Amy, go figure it out.
Right. Well, what I do is I read through these NoFAs 3, 4, 5 times, and you really have to get comfortable with federal talk, federal speak, because a lot of these are written in the same way and they have similar elements. And so in time, you start going through these and you're going to see all these similarities and it won't seem so intimidating. But at first, it does. I create what I call tracking sheets. And for example, in choice neighborhoods, there are 120 pages. I forget how many pages now, 100 pages of narrative, and then 100 and maybe 25, 50 pages or more of attachments. And so what I do is I track every single element on these tracking sheets. So my tracking sheets are legal size, small print, 2 pages, but every single element is tracked. And then when we sit down and have weekly meetings, everybody is involved in those meetings. So, for example, the city should always be involved in these projects as well as the owner of the housing, whether it's the housing authority or an assisted housing owner. And so every week you have all those people at the table, and people in the city are required then to go back to various city agencies to pull data where it's needed and so forth. And then there are other people on the call that are technical experts, architects and engineers. You want to use them sparingly because they're so expensive, and financial managers and so forth. So the person that's running the process, and I did when I did these, is they're basically going through every single element. Where do we stand on this? Where do we stand on this? How is this going? How is this going? And this going? So that once you have all this stuff moving, then you can be creative. You can be the creative writer that you want to be, knowing that all the architecture is taken care of because you're tracking every single element. And I have to say, HUD is so picayune, and may other funders are this way too, but my experiences with HUD, if you're missing one little element, it's points off. And I did it was a heartbreaking thing. It was an excellent, excellent application. But one of the chapters, oddly, was transmitted in track changes. Somehow, I don't know how that happened, but it did. And HUD refused to save it as regular, and they counted when you do track changes, you got many more pages because you've crossed things out and so forth and so on. They refused to count then the last pages of that whole application because all those pages dropped off. They were the excess pages because the track pages. So they wouldn't read the track pages and they wouldn't look at the last chapter, which was summarize the project. This was an excellent project. It had everything it needed to be successful, everything. And that's how picky they are. They are so picayune. That's why you have to track. It seems crazy and excessive, but if you don't track every single element, you know something's going to fall through. And so here's another example. Let's say you have to describe the community's socioeconomic attributes along the lines of income, family composition, family size, racial breakdown, all these things. If you miss one of those little elements, well, that takes points off. You just have to be crazy on top of it for each element.
Wow. I mean, talk about a little bit of stress to say the least
Well,
here.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, I mean, it makes sense that you have to be that detail oriented, but when you talk about hundreds of pages of narratives and
Right.
documents, it's easy to lose track of it. And then on top of it, you're trying to consolidate feedback from everybody on the working team, not just the city, but architect, engineers on top of that. And they're billing by the hour too on some of these professionals. So,
Exactly.
on this list of all these awards, what grants are still sort of around today, and what's sort of applicable for people that are looking for projects to pursue a grant?
So going down the list, the choice neighborhoods, both the implementation and planning grants are still out there. The third one down, community grants. Most communities have community foundations, and a number of those focus on housing. And so it's worth your while to take a look at those community foundations in your area or in the area of the property that you're going to be working on. In this particular case, we use that money to do a study whether or not a small medical clinic at one of these sites would work. And then it turned out it didn't, but those dollars were really helpful in taking a look at that. So the emergency safety and security is still out there for public housing authorities. Family self-sufficiency is current for both regular FSS and new applicants. The HUD Assistant Service Coordinator, I believe, is still out there. Family unification is out there. Not the graduate incentives, the Health Center Cluster Planning Grant that is still out there. Hope 6 has been replaced. Mainstream vouchers is still out there. The mobility demonstration vouchers, this is a new program that just came out in 2021 or 2022. And that is, I don't think they're taking more housing authority applicants right now, but I did win one. It's a cool program. Moving to work has just recently been expanded. I don't think they're doing any more of that. The foreclosure settlement came about because of the 2008 market crash and the S&L crash. So that was specific to that. Native American housing block grants are still out there. Neighborhood network centers are not. Ross and Ross Family is still out there. Ross for Education is not. And then Section 811 capital advance is still out there. Hadn't been published in years and years and just came out again around 2020, 2022. So
And
most of the stuff's out there.
got it. That's really helpful. So this is very, very relevant for everybody that's listening to this stuff out there.
Right.
And when you think about all these grants, Amy, we talked about choice neighborhoods and Hope Six, obviously. Are these grants primarily for renovating apartment units, or can they also be applied, or specifically to be applied to services?
Yeah.
How should people look at these grants when they think about, hey, what can I
Well,
use this money for? Is it full open discretion and they can just use a slush fund for whatever
right.
to
No, it's not. And that's, I'm glad you raised that point because these dollars are generally not fungible. So within a grant, there'll be a cap that you can use, for example, in choice neighborhoods on housing. So for the $30 million grant, there's, let's just say you get that amount, who knows what the amounts are going to be. Then 21 million will be for housing. And then half of the nine that's left, 4.5 million will be for people, what they call, resident services. And then 4.5 million is for the neighborhood, for neighborhood improvements and attributes. And they're not fungible. So you have to keep that in mind when you take a look at these. You can't just take the grant and then do whatever you want with it. It's real specific.
got
So
it. And I really like the fact that you talked about how these grants can be used for specifically to improve the neighborhood. So obviously, you and I
right.
both know to just put residents in an area and just hope they succeed, that's probably not good enough.
No, it's
And
no.
you have to provide services. You mentioned caseworkers earlier. What sort of services do you think in your career have you seen that has been the most impactful? Are they so? And I'm gonna throw some random examples out there, and you let me know, like job readiness, whether it's supportive services to help folks stay out of chronic homelessness. What kind of services have you seen that has been very successful in your career that these grant
Oh,
dollars have been
and
applied
it's a
to?
really good question. So first, I'd say it really depends on the community because each community is going to be a little different. And then it depends on the population. So, for example, if you're working with a program that deals with homeless individuals, as you point out, well, you really have to get to know your clients and you have to figure out what's really issue. I mean, it could be a whole range of things. It could be credit issues. There could be substance abuse issues. There could be problems with incarceration. And so all those things have to be worked out on an individual basis. But in general, the ones that HUD likes, you can see that they've created their own programs from that, is family self-sufficiency and resident opportunity self-sufficiency. And those programs really focus on employment, training, employment, job placement, job retention activities, and helping people follow through that whole process. With FSS, as you earn more money, then your rent would go up because it's a income-based rent in public housing and Section 8. Well, the difference between what you used to pay and the difference between what you are paying goes into an escrow account. And so housing authorities maintain those escrow accounts, manage, assign, give them interest, and so forth. So at the end of the program, I mean, a family could have $7,000, $8,000 that they can then take out from that escrow account and apply it to something else they want to do, maybe education, maybe it's a business. And so those programs that create wealth, I think it's really what HUD wants to see. And I think those are really what's most critical. Because the idea is you don't want people to have to stay in these dwelling units forever, even though you're going to build the best stuff that you can build. You want people to move up and out. You want people to start creating their own wealth and creating their own communities and doing what they want to do. So that's really where HUD is. And I totally agree with that. I think it's all about generating wealth.
So, Amy, what do you suggest the process should be for first-time grant applicants that are thinking about getting their grant? Do they look for the grant first and the project second, or vice versa?
I think they look for the project first. They consider what they have right there. I mean, so for example, if there's a property they have where a lot of people are unemployed, then I think that's the kind of program they want. If there's a property that is not meeting HQS standards and there are all kinds of construction issues and any other kinds of physical issues, then I think you want to look at those kinds of grants. Some of these programs are established by HUD to work in lots of communities. And so they've taken their knowledge over the decades through the various housing programs and community services programs. And they say, okay, in many, many communities, we see that there's a real need for modernization funds, or there's a real need for resident services programs, employment and training programs, and so forth. And so in those cases where there's a program that's specific for troubled housing authorities or troubled sites, for example, then it just makes sense to look at that grant. Then you could say, okay, since HUD knows that there are hundreds of these properties out there in the field, mine might be one of them, then yeah, look at the grant and see if you can make it work. But for the most part, I think it makes more sense to take an inventory of what you have. And rather than going shopping for a grant application, where can I apply it? And I think that's where a lot of people get in trouble because they look at the dollars and they think, oh man, 30 million, look at what I'm going to do. And they create their pro formas and here's all this money. And they don't think about what all has to be on the table in order to make that work. And they build up a lot of people's anticipation and it gets thwarted at the end, particularly residents who think, oh, this is my opportunity to move up and out and I'm going to be able to get a house and I'm going to have all this wonderful stuff. And it's really a problem of the people that didn't think it through in the first place. So that's what I'd suggest.
Ooh, that's such a good comment. And Sherri, I know you learned a ton from Amy. How have you applied that process to your career? Did you in the past start off thinking like, hey, I see this grant, let me go find a project? How did you approach it and what did you learn from that? I want to bring you into the conversation a little bit.
Sure. So first, let me say that everything I know about grant writing, I learned initially from Amy. So like I have learned a lot in the last 20 years since I first met Amy and we worked on our first grant together. And I would say, what Amy was so good at was keeping the vision of the applicant focused on the deliverables that the funding agency or funder wants to see. Because it's really easy to get distracted and start wandering all over the place with the vision and, what we want to create. But grant funders tend to be very, very specific. So I have learned that while I can do bits and pieces of it, I need a focused grant writer and an experienced grant writer around me to support me to get from A to Z. That's so critical. And again, Amy and I haven't been successful on every grant application that we've submitted. It takes time, it takes money, it takes resources. So if I've learned anything, I've learned to put my A paper in and let the funding agency decide, not be attached to whether we get it or not, and be willing to risk and lose whatever time, money, and resources we put into it. As long as I put an A paper in, like, again, college paper, I feel good about it. I feel good about putting the A paper in and letting the chips fall where they may. If an applicant gets hung up that I have to get the grant, it's, again, not a good place to write from or to submit from. You have to be willing to lose in order to get in the game for grant writing. That's probably my biggest lesson. I'm willing to lose because the risk is worth it to me for the reward at the end of the day. And I might have to put in 5 or more to get one, but I just keep moving through the paces. And Amy has taught me the importance of just staying focused on what they want to see, not filling our paper with things they don't want to see.
Exactly.
Ooh, that is so good. So, Sherri, I'm so glad you brought up that point about just raising your standards. Make sure you're putting in your best effort, because I mean, that just applies to everything in life. You got to put your best foot forward, and you have to be willing to fail. I mean, that's just like anything else in entrepreneurship. There's no guarantee that you're going to get that grant. There's no guarantee that your project is going to be successful, but you can only control what you can control, and that's putting in the A+ paper, like Sherri talked about. Now, Amy, I'll bring this conversation back to you. You talked a lot about the skills, the knowledge, techniques to be a successful grant writer. When you go look through a NoFA, how do you look through that NoFA analytically so that you can pull out the pieces to make sure that you're putting in that A+ paper in at the end of the day? What sort of skills or techniques can you share with the audience?
When I look at a NoFA, I'm not looking at something that somebody is suggesting. I'm looking at it as this NoFA is state-of-the-art knowledge for this funding organization. And it may be based on decades of experience where they learned what works and what doesn't work. And they have all of those specific elements in that NoFA. And so what I'm reading is exactly what they want to see. So they already have in their mind who they'll fund. They don't have the applicants in mind, but they already have in mind who they'll fund, what that applicant looks like, what that applicant brings to the table. And my job is to fully and completely understand what that is. So I'll read through these things 4 or 5 times. And then I do this massive tracking sheet that I was describing, where every single element is accounted for, every single attachment is accounted for, every single item is tracked over time and responsibility and what's missing and so forth and so on, so that what's left is distillation of what they want to see. Because, you think, oh, it's 120 pages. Oh, that should be easy. Well, it's not. It's nothing. I'm always editing down and shoehorning things in. And before they made you stay with a certain font, I play around to get the teeniest fonts I could. And I, no margins. I mean, I did everything I could to try to, put as much onto the page. They don't let you do that now. But that's what I do. And I think the people that don't do it successfully look at it differently. They look at the NoFA as, here's an opportunity for me to put on my creative thinking hat. And yes, they want that, but you know what? I really think this is more brilliant. And I think HUD will see it once I present it. They're going to see my brilliance, and they're going to say, oh, well, that's the way we should have done it. And of course, that's not going to happen, because the funder has people they have to respond to. They have Congress, or they have a board of directors. And if they're not lending their money to agencies that are going to do the job and do the work and have an outcome that they can be proud of, well, the whole thing looks terrible. And so that's what I always counsel people that don't have all the things ready to go. For example, they don't have the leverage, or they don't have the right people at the table, or they don't have enough financing to do the kind of redevelop they have in mind. Just don't do it. because it's worse to put in something that it doesn't check all the boxes. They lose. You've invested all this money into, as Sherri says, and you're really stuck. And it really hurts the residents in particular, because these folks have lived in these properties and they're seeing a way out. And you're not providing them that way out. You're just doing what you're doing because you want your brilliance to shine through to these readers. So that's what I counsel. And that makes me unpopular for some clients, a number of clients where I've refused to put it together, but these go under my name. And any grant writer has to realize that even though their name's not on the grant, people know who wrote that grant. They know who put this thing together. You have a level of responsibility for it. And if you know that it's not going to work, it's your job as a good consultant to say that.
Okay, Amy, I love the lesson there, because the grant, the NoFA, it's prescriptive. You have to, at the minimum, satisfy everything that HUD is looking for. So obviously you have developers sometimes, very, very entrepreneurial. They want to be creative. They're thinking like, oh, I can do this. This sounds so much more cool.
Right.
But that's definitely not the approach. Do you recommend for people to say, hey, let me follow the NoFA and be as prescriptive as possible, address every point, and then add a little flair, if you will, towards like creativity to help the project stand apart? Do you recommend that, or stick to the NoFA and be as prescriptive and don't add more than is necessary? What's your guidance there?
Yeah, so they say they want creativity. And so creativity is to be encouraged, but it has to be within what they're looking for precisely. So if you want to be creative, there's opportunities to write creatively. However, all these things have to be out there. So you need what I always call the architecture. You need all of that has to be in place, solid lockdown. And then if there's ways that you can make something more interesting, or maybe something that's evidence-based. They tried this out in Cleveland and it really worked well. And so we're going to try it out here in our city too. Those kinds of things can really be effective. Or we tested this particular method of case management services and it really worked for our community for these reasons. Here's our evidence-based research to back it up. Those sorts of things are good. However, you're limited by page numbers. And so you have to focus most of the work in the limited pages you have on what they want to see.
Okay. And maybe just one more item then, just on the whole sense of being analytical when you're addressing how prescriptive these NoFAs are. Is there like a magic word or magic phrase that you can use when you're answering these NoFAs to show that you've got that buy-in, you've got the leverage dollars? What sort of ways have you phrased things that you think are effective to demonstrate the cohesiveness of the team that you put together, and also just the general collaborative nature of everybody that's involved? Because I imagine HUD is going to want to know, hey, is everybody involved, especially for some of the choice neighborhood grants that you were talking about? What sort of like techniques or language do you recommend people consider using in their application for a grant?
Right. And so HUD's not looking so much for language as they are for proof. So, but you could say, oh, we have wonderful partners at the table. But what's more effective is you go back and look at the partnership letters, and every partner is contributing huge sums of money. That proves the point. So
Yes.
you need to prove the point with what you put in the application. You do have, for example, in some of these, a very short introduction where you can write some of those things, but it's useless if you don't back it up with the goods. And so you've got to have those in place. And HUD will figure that out. The funders will figure that out. They know all the tricks. They've read all these things for years. They know when something is not quite truthful, maybe is a good way to put it, where marketing is, salesmanship is going on. They just want to see the goods. And because they're, again, they're risk averse. These places are risk averse. It's a whole lot of money that they are assigning to another city, and they have to be able to back up their decisions. And so they're not going to take chances on somebody that sounds good. They're going to take chances with somebody that's got everything lined up.
So, Amy, can you share some stories of some of your most memorable grants that you've won, and a challenge or two that you had to overcome in the process, and what the impact of that grant or those grants were for the applicants?
We thank you for that question too. That's a fun question. So one of the first ones I did, it was the First Hope 6, and it was in King County, Washington. They won a ton of money. And it was the first one that I had written. It was so much fun. And this property needed everything. It was a huge property. Everything needed to come down and get rebuilt. And I just remember writing up what we were going to be doing for some of the amenities. And I remember writing up this thing about the clock tower. There was going to be this big clock tower, and it was going to be in this public gathering area. And there was going to be these units where there's a unit is over a workspace. And so somebody who would work in the workspace and then live in the unit. And so live work units, and they were called. And so I just remember some of those amenities. And they won, they were top in the nation. They got 99 out of 100 points. And the one point we didn't get was for faith-based partner, which we couldn't identify at the time. And now I'm sure that would be easy, because it's filled with hundreds of people. I'm sure that would be easy. But at the time, we couldn't get the 1 point for that. But 9 years after I wrote it, I went there. And I was visiting friends. And so I called up the Housing Authority and asked if I could have a tour. So they took me out there and they said, here's the clock tower. And I looked up and there it was actualized. I remember writing about it, and here it was in life. And there were cars pulling up and down, doing their thing, not realizing that I was there, or they were, and so it was amazing. And then I got to see the live work units, and I was thinking, boy, I'd like to live in one of those units at some point. It would be kind of fun. And it just made me realize that when they're well done, you want to be there, you want to live there, you want to participate in all those things that are going on. And so I think that really stayed with me for a long time. I don't get to visit all the ones that I win, and so that one was fun. One of the ones that was challenging was one that we lost. So this is another housing authority, and it was for a property in the Northwest also. And it was a senior property. And we thought we had a good application, but we had a feeling we didn't have enough leverage, but we submitted it anyway. And in fact, they lost. And the reason they lost was because they didn't have enough leverage. And one of the nice things about HUD is they'll do debriefs. So, you'll be on the phone and they'll tell you, well, you could have strengthened the capacity, or you could have strengthened, more leverage, or I would have really liked to see this, that, and the other thing. So you take copious notes, and then they wanted to do it again. And we did it again and they won. And we won just based on what they told us, and then securing more leverage. And that I had just checked that out the other day, and that property is still gorgeous. And so they won, I think, in 2008. So now it's 2024. The property's gorgeous. It seeded a transformation in that part of the town, and it did exactly what they intended it to do. And so it was wonderful. But there was that stumbling block, that we had to take a hit on the first one and lose it in order to win the next one. And then they went with it.
So you would say there's value in submitting in that case, even if you don't win, because the feedback positions you to put a stronger application in the following year.
That's right. And, we thought we had enough to win points, but we thought, okay, we'll get more points on this. We always self-score, and that's another thing. We self-score beforehand, we self-score afterwards, just to say, as you point out, are we doing an A paper here? And so we thought we had, but we had some doubts, and so it was still worth submitting. But yes, exactly, that was it. And they had that attitude too. They weren't happy they lost, but the second time around was a whole lot easier to put that together.
Wow. So I loved how you took that feedback and you made the grant application better. How did you go and get more leverage dollars in that case? Like, how did you present that case, Amy? Did you say, hey, we just missed this grant, so city or whatever, or county or whatever, can you allocate some more capital or from your budget that can help us get our commitments higher? Like, how did you approach solving that problem exactly? I
Right.
want audience to really get some tactical value on how to present the little gaps that might just get them over the cliff and win
Right.
these awards.
Well, that knowledge came to them during their debrief. And then they also got a scoring sheet with their letter that said they didn't win. So it was very apparent. So I really didn't have to do anything in that case. But yes, so they secured more funding, and I've forgotten where they secured more funding, if it came from another source but yes, once it became so clear what the issue was, then it was just a matter of solving that particular issue, knowing that in the other respects, we had a solid application.
Awesome. And then maybe I'll ask this other question. What are some other reasons or feedback that you've gotten in the past regarding why your team was able to win? So obviously this was a high leverage dollar. What other lessons were there in your career of the reasons why you might not have won a grant application? Because I want the audience to understand and prevent, hopefully, by listening to this podcast with you, Amy, to look out for these pitfalls so that they don't make that same mistake, especially if they can learn from one of your past debriefs.
Right. So I remember another application that I worked on, and they're leverage letters from community-based services, and we had dozens of them. But they wanted me to write a template for all these letters. And so the problem with that is that all the letters sound the same. And so basically, it's you want the entity that's going to deliver the services to write it because they have their own flavor, they have their own point of view, their own jargon, and so forth. But by writing the template, and many of these places took the lazy way out and said, okay, I'm going to take the template, I'm just going to put my name here. Fred Smith, Industries going to provide such and such training, so that they all look the same. Well, a lot of those letters didn't get counted for that reason, because HUD determined they weren't legitimate letters, or they must not be. So I think I've raised this before. They are so picky about what they want to see in these things. The best thing to do is absolutely follow every little step and do that. And so with letters, if somebody's just saying, I don't want to write a letter, I try to meet with them and suggest some things that they might want to put in that letter, or, and then let them go with it, because then, you really are looking as though you have a lot of people at the table. That's what you're trying to get across to them. We've got all these people. They're all diverse. They all express themselves differently. They have different kinds of things to offer. So that's an example of something that still kills me.
So, Amy, do you have like stories or examples of applicants who did things that you would highly advise applicants listening to this podcast to not do, or advise against, or maybe the way that you would suggest applicants approach the process? For things, pitfalls, I guess I'm asking you, what pitfalls do you see that applicants have encountered that you would advise them, based on your experience, to be careful of and not fall in those pit holes?
Yeah, that's a good question. What everybody really needs is a very strong manager of the process, because it is too easy to have certain entities take over. So, for example, in some places, if there's an aggressive developer and that developer is all about money, and that developer is thinking, okay, I want to figure out how I can get the most out of this deal and how I can get out of it and totally in the least amount of time. And that kind of approach isn't going to win funds, I mean, and also if it does, you're really stuck out there in the field where a developer picks up and leaves, and you're stuck with all kinds of problems. So you really need somebody at the head that has the support of the lead applicant. And you have to keep all that stuff under control. And that's easier said than done in some cities. But I know I've had to lower the beam, and you just have to be comfortable having to do that. And Sherri, I know you've been there too. Sometimes you just have to say, no, this isn't going to work. If you're not bought in, we got to get somebody else, or whatever. Or this is what we need. If you can't produce this by such and such a date, we can't use you. You just have to have that attitude. So it's don't think of grant writer as an English major. You need to think of the grant writer as a manager who doesn't take guff and who can just move a process. So I think that's really important to know. I think one of the things that I noticed when I first started doing this is that people had a really different idea in their minds of what grant writer meant. It meant, making nice about a subject or expressing things in a nice way. And that's really not what it's about. It's really about deep knowledge, management ability, and just plowing stuff through, which makes it less glamorous, but that's what you need.
And so you would say, if I'm hearing you correctly, you would say that applicants need a grant champion, a local champion,
Right.
to champion the project. You can write the grant, but then getting the grant, implementing the grant takes a champion that's a local champion.
It takes a champion. And I think of it as a navigator, because you're really navigating the process through. So that's for my new business. I'm going to be using that term, because you're not there necessarily in those cities. You're not living in those cities. You're not a part of that city, but you're navigating the process through on behalf of the lead applicant primarily.
Wow. And Sherri, I want to bring you in, right? Because I think we hear about all these stories. And Sherri, I know you've been through it. If you're willing to share, I mean, I'm really curious to understand from you, what sort of grants have you done in the past? And And I bet this is the angst of some grant writers where you have a project that in your mind, you have this vision for how the project's going to be, but somewhere along the way, you might be confronted with an obstacle where you have to go and change a couple of things. Are you able to share some of your experience, Sherri, on how you had to approach those types of obstacles and what you had to do?
Yes, absolutely. So, a recent grant application that I still have pending right now, waiting for feedback from HUD on, was a perfect example of where I came up with the vision and the plan. And I started pulling all the parties together, as Amy talked about, having this very collaborative conversation with local politicians and government officials and residents, and then HUD experts on like relocation and grant writing and things. And the relocation folks threw me a curve in the 11th hour on my plan, because my original plan, as I redeveloped the site, it did not contemplate an option for the folks that are currently living on the site to be relocated back to the site, because I was taking an all family property and turning it into a senior property. So of course, once they were 62 years old, they wouldn't have the opportunity to return. And I heard what I needed to hear, but I did not like it, because the relocation consultant said to me, Sherri, HUD is not going to like your relocation plan. They do not like to displace people. And in the moment, my ego just jumped off, because I'm in the 11th hour. I've been working on this grant with the grant writer and all these folks. I've been telling them it's going to be 100% senior property. I've been saying this for the last 3 months. And as soon as they said it, I knew it was true. Mm. So I had to sleep on it. I had to get over myself. And the next morning I woke up and I said, I'm going to split this site plan into 2 pieces. I'm going to make a family section and I'm going to make an elderly section. So I'm going to downsize the senior component, but I'm going to give HUD what they want, because this person knows. This person had more than 20 or 30 years of experience writing relocation and doing relocation for HUD. So you have to listen. You know, that's probably one of my biggest lessons. Even though I've been doing this for over 30 years, you're showing up and you're always staying open to things you hadn't thought about, and be willing to change. My plan is still a great development plan. It's just different than I originally envisioned. And so it's actually going to be better when it gets funded, because I have a place for everybody now.
That is such a good story. And Sherri, I cannot thank you enough for being a little vulnerable and sharing that story, because that provides a tremendous amount of tactical value for the audience listening today. You're going to get feedback that you might not necessarily like, because you might have been emotionally attached to the vision that you had. And Sherri just showed you exactly what you need to do in those situations, not only to be self-aware, but be willing to be open-minded enough to accommodate people that are actually trying to help you. They're not trying to bash on your plan. They're trying to help you. And I think that's just a great example. And Amy, I'll bring this conversation back to you. Did you ever have any stories like that where you're that far along the grant process and you had to pivot a little bit? Any stories like that you can share?
Oh, dear. We didn't have any major pivot like that. But that's a really good point.
Well, that's why it's great to have both of you on the podcast sharing your diverse experiences. And Amy, I know we're getting near the end of the podcast today, and I want to pose you a question that I ask everybody that comes on the podcast. And the reason behind this podcast question that I ask every guest is that people have told me that affordable housing is impossible to solve for. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's only a matter of time before we collect all the pieces to the puzzle. Even if it's not our generation, it's all the pieces that we can pass on to the next generation, because they can go take that and run from it. And I think grant writing and being able to manage and navigate the entire process of getting a grant is one of those pieces of the puzzle that people can employ in their journey. So, Amy, why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, is just so hard to solve for?
It's such a good question. And I've thought about this a lot. I think one of the biggest issues is that developers of affordable housing and market rate housing have different amounts of difficulty. Affordable housing, you need a lot more skills and you need a lot more money. and you need a lot more willingness to build partnerships than you do in market rate housing. So market rate housing, you pick out a site. I mean, there are issues with the city for zoning and for building and so forth, but you build what you think the market will bear based on your own understanding of who your buyers might be, and it's done. And you people move in. Maybe you've built the property to appeal to younger workers, who are not ready to buy a house, but they're living in these beautiful units. And so it's so much clarity. And you're bringing in enough rent to pay the bills and to set aside money for maintenance and for capital improvements. So compare that with affordable housing. The residents that come in are pay an income-based rent. They don't pay a market-based rent. And the income-based rent guarantees that it won't generate enough revenues to pay for the ongoing operation of that building or to contribute to capital improvement needs. And you're dealing with a population that may need a whole variety of social services the private sector doesn't have to do. If you're a developer and you don't care about that kind of stuff, you don't build that stuff in, well, you end up having a lot of problems. You don't have enough money for management, or you don't do a good enough job in screening. There's any number of things that you have to be really good at. And most people aren't good at all those things. So it is not a comfortable thing for a private developer to admit that it's harder to do affordable housing. They don't want to do that. They don't want to hear that. And yet you see those folks go into affordable housing business, and with the attitude that they bring, it doesn't work. And I think we had a property in my own neighborhood. It was a homeless property, a shelter that was built a few years back, and it's terrible now. I mean, they've basically moved everybody out. The developer went bankrupt, the management company's gone, the place is a wreck, and it's an eyesore. And that contributes to NIMBYism. You can't blame people who know nothing about affordable housing or anything else, and they look at that, they point at that, and it's always your uncle who hates affordable housing and says, look, look at what affordable housing looks like. That's what I don't want in my neighborhood. And it all starts by taking all these shortcuts for a product that needs a whole lot of investment. And I think if people who are in affordable housing get that part of their compensation is financial, but a lot of their compensation is moral, you did the right thing, you're helping people out in the right way. And a lot of people in the private sector aren't comfortable with that idea of compensation being doing the right thing. I mean, that was my experience when I was in business school. Some people, not all, but there are some people just don't have that attitude. So the attitude needs to change, and the understanding of what is needed needs to change. And then the willingness to embrace all those things needs to change. And there are so many good properties out there that even your terrible uncle would not say is affordable housing. There's gorgeous stuff I've seen in Atlanta, and I've seen in Seattle and Minneapolis and other cities. But you really have to change your attitude in order to make that happen. And I think that's our next big battle, is making people understand what's needed and that it's reasonable and that's it's investment that's worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Amy, for going through that and helping me dispel some of the myths around it, because you shared the perfect comparison between projects that are well run with great services that looks beautiful, and then you have those other projects that someone might have been too ambitious, or they didn't account for all the maintenance and the supportive services that needed to be in place to support those residents. I mean, there are going to be bad apples no matter where you go, market rate or affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you were able to raise so much awareness about that it can be successful, it can be run efficiently, and also in a beautiful, sustainable way for the residents. And Amy, I'm so grateful that you came onto the podcast today. Sherri, I'm so grateful that you decided to come on and be a co-host with me today. I learned so much during this conversation. I had so much fun, really, honestly, genuinely. I love this stuff. And to hear from two experts such as both of you today, oh, this is so gratifying. I love what I do because I get to talk to folks like you, both of you, every single day. So I'm so grateful for the both of you for coming onto the podcast today. And Amy, I know you just talked. And Sherri, did you have any parting words for what other advice you might have for folks listening today?
I just want to piggyback on Amy's comments about why developers don't want to do affordable housing. If you come at it from making every last dollar, you're likely to find yourself in a place that is difficult to maneuver, to navigate, to use Amy's words. My example that I can give you is that I have 13 single family homes woven into a brand new subdivision in a small town in Texas. And when the homeowners next to us found out that we were a nonprofit that did affordable housing, all their NIMBYism showed up, right? But what we do is we hire the landscaping and the lawn care people to mow their grass, knowing that low-income people don't necessarily have the resources and don't have the same standard to mow the grass. And so instead, the first year, everyone wanted to run us off the street for bringing affordable housing into their neighborhood. And after year one, and our lawns looked better than other homeowners who lived on the street, all of a sudden, the conversation changed. Because when we get an HOA violation, we are on it, we fix it, we are good neighbors. That's the difference. However, there's a cost, a $12,000 cost to our bottom line to mow the grass on 13 houses throughout the year. That's the difference. If we're looking as affordable housing developers, if we are looking to make every last dime on a deal, we are not going to be successful. The neighborhood is going to run us out. If we do the extra things to take care of the families who need those kind of supportive services, whether it's case management, financial services, or whether it's mowing their grass, that's the difference on how to be successful, in my opinion, as a developer of affordable housing. And I just wanted to leave you with that. There's cost to it, but so worth it, because we changed all those owners' opinions of what affordable housing looked like on that street.
Yes, that's so good. I hope everybody rewinds, listens to this podcast twice, because those the standards, the elevated standards that we have for ourselves and for our residents, that's what's going to drive the difference in this country, frankly. And Amy, for people that want to find out more about you, tell us a little bit about what you're working on and where can people eventually get in touch with you or find out how to learn more from you.
So my business is Grant Writing Sherpa, and I want to work with affordable housing developers, property managers, service providers to basically teach them everything that I learned over my 45 years of being in this business. And my ultimate goal is to increase affordable housing around the nation just by empowering others to do it. And so I'm in the process of developing my website, my Substack presence, and so forth. And so ultimately, I want to be able to do training sessions where people can participate and we can go through an application. We could talk about how to do this properly and so forth. And then to do sessions that people could buy, just kind of discuss sort of the things that we talked about today, only a little bit more depth. And so that's my goal, what I'll be working on in the next few months.
Amazing, Amy. And I'm assuming when the website's up, you can send that to me. I can kind of link it to the show notes. People can kind of follow you.
Yes,
And meanwhile, do you prefer people to reach out to you or follow you on LinkedIn, perhaps? Or what's your preference there? Or just contact you through your website when that is up?
Yeah, my email. They can contact me through email right now, which is amykell0450@gmail.com.
All right. Amy Kell, AMYKELL.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Amazing. Amy, Sherri, thank you both so much for coming onto the podcast today. I cannot wait to bring you all back on. Maybe we can get you back on in a couple months from now and we can talk about maybe a live NoFA and we'll talk through about how to actually go through it. I think that would be incredibly fun and incredibly valuable for the audience. Yeah. All right.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you. And we are out.